Welcome back to the conference on gender equality hosted by European Institute for Gender Equality and Germany's presidency of the EU Council and Germany's chair of the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers. In the previous panel, we learned about the status of gender equality in Europe and about actions taken by institutions and by the German and the Portuguese government and by the EU Commission. And now we would like to discuss about the effects of COVID-19 to gender equality and about concrete measures. We would be happy to receive questions from the audience, so you are more than invited to put questions through our Q&A tool. You'll find it on the homepage. I would like to introduce to you our panel members. We are very glad that Evelyn Regner is with us, chair of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality in the European Parliament, member of Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Hello, nice to have you with us. Sabine Kräuter-Stockton is joining us as well, member of the group of experts on action against violence against women and domestic violence, GREVIO. She is also senior public prosecutor in the German federal state Saarland. Good afternoon. Josephine Ortleb is with us, a member of German Bundestag, Social Democrat Party, member of the Committee on Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth. And we are happy to welcome Maruša Gortnar, Head of Operations Unit at the European Institute for Gender Equality. And until last year, she was Head of Equal Opportunities Department in the Slovenian Ministry of Labor, Family and Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities. So, first of all, we would like to dive a bit deeper into the issue of violence against women, and we will talk about what impact the pandemic might have. Let's hear, first of all, a short video statement by German National Helpline, which the federal minister already mentioned. We will see what experience they have made with the pandemic.
Good afternoon. I'm Petra Söchting, head of the German National Violence Against Women Helpline. Since 2013, the helpline is available round the clock, free of charge, anonymous, via phone, chat or email. Around 80 female helpline workers offer counseling support to the callers, which is available in 18 languages. We managed to continue the support offer of our helpline during the COVID-19 pandemic without any limitations. Since April, we recorded an increase in counseling calls. Compared to the previous year, the number of counseling cases rose by 20%. The number of calls relating to domestic violence increased accordingly. But it is important to note that it's not possible to deduce that there has been a general increase of intimate partner violence during COVID-19 solely based on those figures. The number of counseling cases at the helpline depended significantly on awareness of this support offer in the public. Since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, the helpline has been publicized on multiple channels as the main entry point for support for women who experience violence. For example, through the initiative Stronger Than Violence of the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth. However, our counseling sessions show that the limitations and burdens of the COVID-19 pandemic in many cases led to an escalation of conflicts and violence in partnerships. This highlights the importance of reliable support offers for women who experience violence in times of crisis.
Thank you very much for these insights from the German National Helpline. And I would like to ask, first of all, Mrs. Ortleb, as a parliamentarian of the German Bundestag, how do you see the situation of violence against women during the pandemic? And what issues have been brought to you eventually by your constituency? And how do you plan to address this issue?
Yeah. Hello, to everybody, and I'm glad to discuss today with you all. And since the beginning of the corona pandemic, we are quite concerned that cases of domestic violence will increase in Germany. And as we hear now from Petra Sechting, first evaluations of helpline calls show that the concerns became reality. Women's counseling facilities and women's shelters confirm these first evaluations, and limited space at home, financial concerns, as well as the fear of losing one's jobs trigger domestic violence and are intensified even more by and during the crisis. And I'm in contact with women's shelters and women's counseling facilities in my constituency. And in the beginning of the pandemic, we were very concerned whether the capacity within the shelters are enough. We managed to react fast by using hostels as safe spaces. Until now, this not has been necessary. And we also had quite fast contact lists and addresses where women could ask for help, were distributed all over my constituency and my federal state. This was really important because the first studies have shown that women are not well informed about the help mechanism as we thought. Sometimes they might know about these services, but they do not use them. That is the reason why I support the campaign in the framework of the initiative Stärker als Gewalt, which draws attention to these offers of help, for example, in supermarkets. And during the first lockdown in March, I urged the supermarkets in my constituency to participate in these campaigns and to raise awareness. However, there has no be a guarantee that every woman that needs help has the right to a safe space in a women's shelter. We are still a long way off from achieving this aim. To change this is my job as a parliamentarian. Together with our minister, we, the SPD group, want to guarantee that women are safe from violence by renovating and expanding the infrastructure of women's shelters all over Germany. And there is not only one thing I want to mention. During my participation at the 63rd session of the Commission on the Status of Women in New York in March 2019, I had I had the chance to visit the New York Family Justice Center, where I received good ideas on how to support all victims of domestic violence holistically. I really hope that a center like this will be established in my federal state.
Thank you, Mrs. Ortleb, for the moment. Let's get the European perspective on this. Mrs. Regner, the statement we just heard earlier, what does this mean for women affected by gender-based violence on the European level, and how is the EU supporting member states' measures to protect women from gender-based violence?
So, good afternoon to all of you. I mean, you can imagine the situation is more or less the same or quite similar all over Europe. So what we heard right now, the figures that are shown in Germany, you can find more or less everywhere. There are slight differences, but this depends on data. We need data. I mean, the more helplines you have, the more the percentage is going up. Because when you have helplines, they can really do something and they can listen. And you have so many countries where you don't have enough helplines. We have the situation, and therefore the crucial thing on violence is also on all these background situation. We have a situation where women, and we had here data from Portugal, are looking in the website. So when you just look at the clicks, and so somehow where women could look a little bit more, where can I find help? This is going up completely, steep. The curve is completely steep and even far higher than the figures that have been presented. And then we heard, simply to give you an example from Portugal, from the police, that there are not so many women going to the police. So there is sort of this fear of the threshold, the fear what the neighbors say, and we don't have to forget that women are normally living with the perpetrator. So it is the husband, it is the partner, it's the ex-partner, it's somebody of the family. That's the situation. We got from Austria, for example, right now, today, so the very actual data, 38% the helpline figures are going up. So women are really asking for help. We can say coronavirus sharpens existing inequalities, is really a deep threat for women, is very bad concerning the situation of violence. So the Istanbul Convention should be really ratified by all member states as soon as possible. A very precious instrument from the Council of Europe, who is also present with GREVIO today. And of course, also money matters. And therefore, already would like to say that also maybe for the rest of the debate, that I'm very happy that we succeeded for the new multi-annual framework, gender mainstreaming, and we will do a very strong monitoring, because it's also the question to finance all the women's shelters, all the measures, and I'm very happy that we have that in the finances for the future of Europe as well, and that we did well to negotiate all on that. And of course, as I mentioned before, data. Data is so important that we collect them, because I always want to talk on the positive examples, Finland gives us really an excellent example what you can do based on collecting data and connecting, doing sort of interconnection of the data of police, of the justice system, of the institutions, NGOs who deliver the figures concerning violence. There could be presented a national action plan to combat violence. We need to know what are the signs, what are the symbols that violence is popping up. And when we learn more about the structure of violence, then of course we can do far better also to prevent, and not only to punish and protect and to the measures afterwards, which also cost the society, of course, a lot of money.
Thanks, Mrs. Regner, for the moment. Well, let's get a little bit more background information about this phenomena. Mrs. Gortnar, what did EIGE's study on the implications of COVID-19 for women victims of intimate partner violence reveal? And can you maybe also outline what measures do you recommend to the EU and its member states?
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody, and it's a pleasure to be in this panel and this conference today on behalf of EIGE. So why did we undertake this study in the first place? Very early in the pandemic, we started receiving information about the increase of violence against women cases. We have heard earlier today already some numbers. So for example, France saw a jump of 32% of domestic violence cases reports just over a week in the pandemic. Also Lithuania, 20% in a 3-week lockdown period. Apart from that, there was also an evidence from previous disasters, from previous pandemics, from previous crises, that in those times actually violence against women and intimate partner violence increases significantly. So we have decided to focus in our study on access to support services for women victims of intimate partner violence, especially during the COVID crisis. And our study revealed that all the member states took action. So they did take measures. We have identified in the study 228 individual measures taken by member states across all 27 member states. This included 167 new measures and 61 existing measures that were even adapted or changed for as a response to pandemic. Quite a number of these measures, out of these 228, 137 were implemented by the government. So this is in a way good news, meaning that it's politically recognized, the problem is politically recognized as well. And 64 cases or 64 measures were implemented by civil society organizations, and even some, 4 of them were implemented by the private sector. What is very important is also partnership between different organizations, and 15 different measures were implemented through such partnership with the different sectors. And what types of measures we saw? These measures ranged from awareness-raising campaigns, wider support to communication tools, such as helplines, alternative online services. We heard about the chat box as an option in the German helpline, as well as judicial and legislative measures. On the recommendations are always important coming from such studies because they are evidence-based. So among the recommendations, I would like to highlight a few. Member states have to develop national action plans, and these action plans have to be supported or set out in the detailed strategies for supporting women and also their children in times of crisis, of different crises, not only pandemics. It has to outline which stakeholders should be involved, and what is always important, what funding resources will be devoted to these measures. What came out as very important from this study, and also in many member states, to consider support services for women victims of intimate partner violence as essential services, meaning that these services are not closed during lockdowns and measures taken at the national level. We heard funding is important, additional funding to expand the capacity of support services to be able to support women victims of intimate partner violence. This funding goes to support services as well as providing suitable working conditions for staff working in the support services. Yes, in the context of limited in-person service delivery, it's important to develop tailored risk assessment procedures. And these risk assessment procedures we can support at EIGE with our risk assessment and risk management principles we have developed in 2019.
Okay, Mrs. Gortnar.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the moment. You listed up so many wonderful initiatives. I think we come back to this in a minute, but let's first have the perspective of another organization of GREVIO, and I would like to ask Mrs. Kräuter-Stockton. GREVIO is the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against violence against women and domestic violence. This is a monitoring mechanism for the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. So my question, Mrs. Kräuter-Stockton, how has the pandemic affected your work at GREVIO, and do you have plans to include questions regarding the implication of the pandemic in your next round of evaluations?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and also from my side, good afternoon to everyone. Indeed, the pandemic has affected GREVIO's work, but not too much. As you know, GREVIO is a work of experts from different countries and different professional backgrounds, and the whole of GREVIO is, as it is often the case, more than just the sum of its parts. The quality of our work relies on working together as a group and in cooperation with the extremely able and clever members of our secretariat. And so we do our best to keep on working as a group. Therefore, we have had virtual plenary meetings that guarantee an active exchange. And regarding the country visits, which are an essential tool in our monitoring procedure, while we had to postpone some of them, delegations of GREVIO recently could visit San Marino, Slovenia, and Poland. So like everyone, we try to deal with the difficulties and to arrange our plans. Now, concerning the impact of the pandemic on the current baseline evaluation procedure, we will, of course, keep the focus on all the issues and requirements of the convention. But considering the massive impact of the pandemic on the provision of services of support and protection, naturally, this impact too is being discussed in GREVIO's evaluation visits. However, this means the delegation is not focusing expressly on aspects related to the pandemic, but where it has affected the country's ability to implement the convention. This will be addressed in the GREVIO report, not in a separate section, not as a focus, but where it is relevant, it will be addressed. Now, your question was regarding the next round of evaluation. This is still far off. GREVIO will certainly take into account any lessons learned and all lingering challenges in implementing the convention when the scope of the next evaluation round must be defined. But GREVIO has still 16 state parties to evaluate and is only about halfway through its first baseline evaluation procedure. So there are no concrete plans for the next round.
Mm-hmm. Mrs. Ortleb, if we look at the German situation, what would you say are the main achievements of Germany in its implementation of the Istanbul Convention, and where do you see the main challenges?
So the biggest milestone in order to ratify the Istanbul Convention in the first place was the reform of the sexual criminal law and the establishment of the principle no means no within the criminal law. Since then, we as lawmakers worked constantly for the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, and we managed to draw public attention to the measure of the convention that shows parts of the implementation of the Istanbul Convention lies within the criminal law. Despite that, the implementation concerned the support system in general. The federal system in Germany demands from each federal state to provide sufficient spaces in women's shelter as well as counseling agencies. And that's a big challenge. Therefore, the aid system for women in Germany is very diverse. In order to ensure a certain standardization, our minister has implemented round table combating violence against women. I'm sure you heard about it, and it's a platform on federal level as well as federal, state level and local level. All three levels work together, but in their own responsibility. And this, of course, is also a financially a big task. We established an investment program, Gemeinsam gegen Gewalt an Frauen, it calls, for the next 4 years with a budget of overall 120 million euro. Renovation, expansion and new buildings, as well as the purchase of women's counseling facilities and women's shelters can be funded. The aim is primarily to secure and enhance access to and safety of the facility for victims of violence. We heard about the helpline, and that's a big part of our support system, and the goal of our presidency of the EU Council is to spread the word of the helpline mechanism all over Europe. However, one challenge remains, I think, the establishment of a national coordination body according to Article 10 of the Istanbul Convention Currently, several different entities assume the responsibility of coordination. We are currently also in the making of establishment a monitoring body, what's also written in the Istanbul Convention, to oversee the combat of violence against women and domestic violence.
Okay, thank you so much. We received many questions, and I would like to pass the first question to Mrs. Regner and maybe also to Mrs. Kräuter-Stockton. The question comes from Gabriele Abels, University of Tübingen in Germany. She's asking, what are the plans of protecting women from violence on the internet? What would it change to make this a Euro crime? Mrs. Regner, is this on your agenda?
Yes, it is definitely on our agenda. Thank you very much for the question. So what is happening right now, what we see all over Europe is in some countries a backlash, is a situation where women are really attacked, and this covers the analog world as well as the digital world. Many women are suffering under this threat, and this is happening. I mean, we see that right now in Poland and in Hungary in a very strong way, where even then there is the split, what is aiming partly in the split of the society, ostracizing LGBTI rights while attacking women's rights, so somehow a no-go. And as we see that all over Europe, we are really on our way to ask for legal instruments in order to protect women. So you mentioned it right now, the Euro crimes in the gender equality strategy that was already presented by the Commission. This is part of it. And if the Istanbul Convention is going on too slowly to be implemented, and of course this is Plan A, and we want that it is really applied by all member states, ratified and implemented and monitored by all member states. But this is really going on too slow, and we don't go forward. It is very important always to signal we have a Plan B. So really a directive on protecting women of all this violence, and this includes the digital violence. I think everybody knows hundreds of cases, what is happening. So we really know what we are talking about. There is a red thread, a structure in it, and taking it into the list of Euro crimes means that the member states should work closely together. And I think just with these crimes, it is also necessary because the perpetrator doesn't look where there are the borders. It's absolutely important. And therefore, it's also important, I would say, that we are acting in a coordinated manner. Coordinated manner is to go together as all member states of the European Union. I see there are some countries already very active on legislation, which of course is something we absolutely need, but there should be a good joint common European standard and not, again, as it is happening so much, a carpet existed of so many little pieces that it doesn't fit together. So this is really of utmost important. And yes, it is on the way. We are preparing, we are doing the initiative in the European Parliament, we are pushing it, and we don't tolerate this violence. This is also so important for me. All this sort of violence for the European Parliament is something we don't tolerate at all, and we just bring it in resolutions as next week in the plenary's agenda, as well as supporting very much all those fantastic women activists and men who are supporting the women in Poland, Hungary, and those countries being affected, most of it.
Mm-hmm. Mrs. Kräuter-Stockton, as you are a senior public prosecutor, maybe you can comment on this briefly as well.
Well, very briefly, I agree to all Mrs. Regner has said. I can just say digital violence or cyber violence is a form of violence. It is part of violence against women, which the Istanbul Convention is dealing with. And I can add that our monitoring GREVIO is working on a general recommendation regarding this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much Well, let's move now to another issue which came up earlier in our discussion. And this is the issue of gender equality in the labor market. How does the situation in Europe looks like in regard to this, and what impact does the pandemic have on the issue? Let's hear a short video statement by the WHO. Here comes Natasha Azopardi-Muscat.
Thanks to the German presidency of the Council of the EU, to Germany's chair of the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers, and to the European Institute of Gender Equality for co-organizing this conference and for inviting WHO to this important event. The starting point for assessing the impact of the pandemic on gender inequalities for us at WHO necessitates that we examine the health sector as an employer, with particular reference to the gender imbalance in both paid and unpaid care. Undoubtedly, gender inequality in the global health workforce was there before COVID-19. As an example, data from 2019 shows that women make up 70% of the health workforce, but only 25% hold senior roles. Moreover, 69% of global health organizations and 80% of board chairs are men. This means that women deliver global health and men lead it. We know that these gaps in gender leadership are driven by stereotypes, discrimination and power imbalances. And we also know that some women are further disadvantaged based on their race or class. In Europe, inequalities remain, although women's representation in the health sector has increased over time, particularly among the higher-wage healthcare occupations. In OECD countries, the share of female physicians between 2000 and 2017 increased by 13%, an average by 0.6% annually. Inequalities also abound in the informal sector. COVID-19 has exacerbated the already existent unpaid and underpaid care burden. The large part of the burden associated with unpaid care work, including health and social care work, in the home, community and long-term care settings is disproportionately borne by women. Women's unpaid care work needs to be recognized, valued and where possible formalized with decent pay, employment conditions and collective representation. The spotlight that COVID-19 has placed on this burning issue provides a window of opportunity to bolster women's economic participation through investing in decent health and social care jobs with equitable pay, working conditions and recognition. Keeping women safe needs to be a priority. We need to ensure that all frontline health and social care workers and caregivers have equitable access to training, PPE, psychosocial support and other essential products, support and social protection, and take into account the specific occupational health and safety needs of women, who constitute the majority of health and social care workers. But we need to go a step further. We must include women in decision-making. Women's expertise and perspective is far too often overlooked in the health systems. Addressing gender inequalities in the health and social care workforce as one of the biggest employment sectors of women could have an enormous impact towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to finish by reminding us that 2020 is the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, and sufficient credit cannot be given to those who have tirelessly been on the front lines and given so much in tackling the pandemic head-on. Here, I am pleased that during our regional committee 2 months ago, Member States endorsed the proposal to extend the Year of the Nurse and Midwife in our region through 2021. It is the least we can do. Where women in the healthcare labour market are concerned, there should not be any talk of a return to the pre-COVID normal, because that normal was not good enough.
Thank you to the WHO. Thank you to the WHO for this statement. I would like to ask Mrs. Gortnar, the studies of EIGE, I think, are confirming exactly these findings we've just heard. What else can you highlight in this regard from your findings and research?
Yes, correctly. The studies highlight what was just said now by the WHO. Women have been in front line of this pandemic, both in the private sphere as well as in public sphere, taking care. So women are primary carers, and we can see that there are almost no improvements on gender equality in the sphere of unpaid care responsibilities over the past years. We have heard some positive information, though, earlier today that during the pandemic, German couples seem to share the burden of home responsibilities more equally, which is very good. However, our results show that it is quite likely that the pandemic will increase inequalities both in care work and in the labor market, and care work in the unpaid sphere or in the private sphere. That's why it is essential to recognize and value care work, both unpaid and paid work. And what is very much important that this crisis also underlined or highlighted the value of care in our economies. That's why it's important that when we talk about recovery measures for the aftermath of the pandemic, we have to take perspective of gender equality, different realities of women and men into account. This means that we have to implement gender mainstreaming, gender impact assessment, gender budgeting. These are all the tools which EIGE has developed and are available for also ready to be available for the EU Recovery Fund. Yes, maybe this is what I would like to share at this point.
Well, look at the European level, Mrs. Regner. What are the current measures of the EU level to counter the effects of the pandemic? And maybe you can also describe briefly what is the position of the European Parliament, actually.
A lot to do. We must not come back to the old normal. We must set measures for a sustainable future, for a good future. And what does that mean? We need a lot of all those care services for the future, also because of the demographic development. We must have a better system who is caring about kids, who is caring about the elderly. Really a broader picture of a carers strategy. This is absolutely important, because the situation that women working, being 70% of those working in the care sector and earning so little money, is a vicious circle. Why? Because under so many normal circumstances, it's women at home who are doing all this and are not paid at all for that. And this causes really a vicious circle we have to close. And therefore the pieces are minimum wage, really a European minimum wage scheme, which is so important because so many exactly in those sectors, because it's segregation, job segregation, where mainly women are there, would really help women to earn better all over Europe. I look at the Romanian women, for example, who are coming, or from Eastern Bulgaria, or from countries where the unemployment is quite high, who are not earning enough money. So somehow the minimum wage could help to stabilize the situation. The measures that will hopefully will be proposed very soon, I hope in December or not later, to bring transparency concerning the gender pay gap, also will help just exactly to go on in this area. And then, as I have before mentioned, a boost to have a better system concerning childcare, also in the countryside during the whole day, not only in the part-time options as it is happening so much, but also offering the elderly. And altogether, this is really this could be really an excellent boost also for jobs. We are talking about climate neutrality, and we know we need all these jobs in the next years. And when we just look at Sweden, for example, where 10% of the working population is in the services sector, we know exactly that this is a boost for job creation, jobs we need, and at the same time, of course, far more climate neutral than pumping the money that is right now invested by the European Union in order to catch up with the negative effects of the pandemic into old systems we have in the industry and so on. So somehow there is really an interconnection in these measures I have mentioned.
Okay, Mrs. Ortleb, how do you react to Mrs. Regner's statement? What is Germany doing nationally and on the EU level? Maybe you can answer this briefly, and maybe you can comment also on the question, what are the lessons learned in terms of keeping women in the workforce?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Ms. Regner, and we see structural issues in the labor markets that many women have to face do not differ within the European Union. Women are less likely to hold management positions. They do not have the same wage for the same labor as their male counterparts, and they are responsible for most of the family care work. Also, in the Corona crisis, women are more affected at the labor market than men. And I want to show an example from Germany. For many married women, the short-time allowance was particularly low. This is because the short-time allowance is calculated according to the net salary. Often married women in Germany have a tax class that is higher than the tax class than their husband's salary. Then again, women are less likely to benefit from top-ups of the short-time allowance by their employers. Furthermore, they work often more in companies without union wages. Unfortunately, many women in Germany work in minimal employments, hence they do not have an entitled to receive short-time allowance. Besides, mostly women reduce their work time in order to provide for their families. These are the first insights of the evaluation of the immediate measures to fight against the corona crisis in Germany. The first effects of the recovery package have shown that they do not apply enough to women. For political sets of measure in the size of recovery package, a systematic monitoring of the impact on women and men is really, really crucial. It's impossible to provide detailed and qualified statements about gender policies within the recovery package without a systematic gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting. We heard it before, but it's really, really necessary. Therefore, in Germany, we are currently working for the establishment of a federal foundation on gender equality in order to strengthen equality policies across all political departments, like EIGE do. And we want to provide and to give that push with our foundation and enable stronger networks on every level and actors in order to have a faster outcome. And I'm sure that we would have a bigger outcome of gender equality politics if we had the same representation of women in political positions. Women are even here underrepresented. Overall, it applies from business to politics. We need to change the balance of power.
Thank you. There are many questions coming in. I would like to pass a question to Mrs. Regner by Svadranka Büttner. What measures are being developed in the EU to counteract old age poverty among women?
Here, I mean, we have to go a little bit deeper, and not only to see that in the gender equality area as such, but also in how we can, what can we do on the social pillar? And the social pillar, that is really an instrument that was introduced in Göteborg some years ago, and I know that the German presidency, but also the Portuguese presidency, will push it very, very much. And this means to look at poverty as such. And it is important that we bring together all economic policies and all social policies in a broader way, that the states are really willing to invest also, and to look also in the social system, that they can offer more money. I mean, that looks all very abstract and very, very, more or less, how should I say, it's a framework that means at the moment the national state is responsible, of course, for fighting poverty of people who are getting elder. And when we just look at the measures we see right now, we need it embedded in a European system of the so-called social pillar. And as a very precise measure, I could say, the closing the pension pay gap. That's another instrument, and that's quite precise, which means with the measures I hope the Commission will present very soon on fighting the gender pay gap, we need also to do something on the gender pension gap, because when you have a rucksack of not being well paid during your whole life, of course, then you can hardly finance your time when you're a retired person.
Thank you. There is another question about paid care workers, and I would like to ask Mrs. Ortleb again. The question comes from Silke Steinhilber. She says, it seems there is a lot of awareness finally about the crisis in paid care work services, particularly the lack of qualified staff. With respect to qualified staff, minimum wage regulations will certainly not be enough. What other measures are envisioned to train and especially retrain qualified paid care workers? So are there more measures? Is the German government planning something? What do you have in mind, Mrs. Ortleb?
Yeah, as Silke, I think, said, we have a big attention now in this crisis to all these issues, and I think we had to do more, because it's really frustrating to see that everybody says it's an important job, but they have really low wage and not that income that they need. And I think it's a major political matter for the next years. We need to new recruits in nursing jobs as well as an early education. We had to change a lot of these things, especially in the past few months. We see that nursing specialists and educators are systemic important twice. They do not only have highly qualified jobs, but they secure the balance of family and work of millions of mothers, fathers, and relatives. And I think we had to talk about it, how we can how we can help them in their situation, how we can change this perspective.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mrs. Kräuter-Stockton, maybe you can give us an idea, how can the Istanbul Convention come in use eventually when we talk about women in the labor market?
Yes, thank you. This is another focus. I would like to talk about Article 17 of the Istanbul Convention. It requires the state parties to encourage and promote the private sector that is companies and enterprises and trade unions as well, to take measures in order to prevent violence against women, as well as assist and support its victims. So the convention says it's not only the state parties that are addressed. Companies and enterprises are expected to take measures, for instance, set up guidelines or standards to this effect with the assistance of the state. And when they do join the state in the fight against violence against women, this is a measure of getting more equality. Now, and companies have to understand that joining the state in the fight against violence against women is in the company's own best interest, because violence against women affects the productivity of the company quite a lot, be it violence in the workplace itself, or be it domestic violence or any other form of violence against women. As victims or perpetrators are distracted during working hours, make mistakes, they miss work, they need sick leave because of injuries, because of stress, they need time off from work as they have dealings with the police or with courts, and they go to prison, etc. Now, shortly, what can companies do, you may ask, regarding the victim? Some examples: when she wants to avoid meeting the perpetrator and she is working usually at the front desk, try relocation of the work tasks. Give her a work that can be done in the back where the perpetrator cannot see her. If she is being stalked by the perpetrator, give her flexible working hours. It can prevent him from carrying on when she has no everyday routine. It can be so small a thing as create safety in the company's car park, or the victim might be granted paid or unpaid leave. If possible, keep her in employment. We know the more precarious the jobs are, the more likely it is for the victim to lose her job, and as a consequence, be more vulnerable still. In big companies, there could be a good practice to establish confidential workplace support services. And when we think of violence against women in the workplace itself, we need effective complaints procedures, and the companies should take disciplinary action against the perpetrator, implement measures to ensure his accountability. So these are only some few possible helpful measures that could be taken by actors of the private sector in the labor market.
Thank you very much. There is another question, and I would like to pass it to Mrs. Ortleb, since I know you have to leave pretty soon. It comes from Nevin from Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen. What kind of support is being provided for refugee women, especially those who live in refugee communities? Is this an issue which is on your agenda as well?
Yeah, but as I say before, all this help, if also refugee women are victims of domestic violence, is normally in the had to deal the federal states. And we see that this issue in all federal states had a really good focus. I cannot speak for all the different places. We also talk about it, but there is no this one law at the moment for this issue.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Mrs. Regner about something which you brought on its way. The EU adopted a work-life balance directive. A new legislative proposal on pay transparency is underway. What else could be done at EU level to ensure that care work is recognized and fairly valued?
I mean, we have to look. I mean, what we have to look is at the huge segregation in the labor market and how these jobs are paid. When you just look, for example, into sectors like the finance services, insurance, and so on, then you see here there are more men that are employed. And then when you look also at the wages and the salaries, that they are comparatively higher than in classic, I say the classic women's jobs. We mentioned them before, the care service. And therefore, the question is right now, how do we go up in areas where mainly women are employed? I just mentioned that because we observe so many jobs, the more women are employed, you just have this effect, the less, the less the whole sector is earning on salaries. So somehow there is always this effect. Does it really help so much when women are saying, okay, we climb up there, the career ladder, where there are the classic men's jobs, and you just see this development. And therefore, it is so important to work out in the directive on the transparency on the salaries, on the huge difference between the men's and women's salary. Which factors, which objective factors are the basis, are the reason why somebody earns less money or why somebody earns more money. And all this is so important to put it also in an objective way for the care jobs. Because when you just see them at the care jobs and we just compare what factors are in there and how you pay them, you just can really develop criteria in order to give a certain weight to the job description and how to weigh them. We just see that in the public sector, and then coming from Vienna, where the system of gender budgeting was introduced and is really also applied already for quite many years, for more than 50 years, and also was introduced and in the constitution, was the basis on a comparison of giving a certain weight and certain value to the different parts of a job and how it is enshrined. And that really helped to develop criteria to earn more money also in the care sector. What else is needed is, you mentioned the work-life balance, that we are really sharing in a better way. And sharing in a better way is something that always makes men, we just saw these examples, when you just go to Finland, for example, where men are remaining longer with the kids when they have babies, in comparison to quite many other countries, that when you just remain longer with the kids, when they are a baby, then you really change also your habit on all these activities that are unpaid care. And when you're just sharing it better, of course, this also makes a shift, not only concerning the share of the care activities, but also giving far more weight and makes it far more valuable when we talk about the paid care. And insofar, all this has to be in a balance. So we need both the criteria in the pay transparency and the sharing, as we already started in the Work-Life Balance Directive. And of course, we should develop further.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, in regard to the time, I would like to put one last question, because we should see if we can have a positive outlook towards the end. Mrs. Gortnar, what makes hope to you that we can reach gender equality in all Europe sooner or later?
Yes, thank you. On a professional level, I would say that what gives me hope is growing interest in EIGE's work, in our data, in our research results, in our tools and methods, in particularly in our tools for gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting. We have a platform for gender mainstreaming available on our website, and there are tools which can support processes of gender mainstreaming for different stakeholders. On a more personal level, I would say seeing and also feeling all these engaged organizations, communities, groups, individuals, women and men, this is very important, who see our society, who want to see our society prosper, who perceive democracy as the core value of the societies of our Europe, and gender equality as one of the core values of our lives, let's say.
Okay. Mrs. Kräuter-Stockton, what makes you confident that we can reach our goals?
Well, professionally as well as private, in my private, as a private person, I can look back and I see so many changes. I can look back in the dark ages of the last century, and there has been so much change. As well, when I look at young women today who are really very clever, very they are engaged. They do a lot, and so I'm hopeful that the way is that there will be the silver lining, and we will reach a good way of sharing.
Mrs. Regner, what is your comment on this? What positive signals do you see, briefly?
It is the strength, it is the staying power, and it is amongst all the solidarity of so many women. I see it in the European Parliament, I see it in the streets of Poland. It matters. And therefore, I already can say, even if it's tough right now, the 21st century is the century of women.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this highly interesting discussion and for sharing your views and your experiences with us. Thank you so much to the audience as well for putting great questions. We've got many, many more questions, but time is running out now. So we keep your words with us and the very positive spirit we're taking with us. So thank you very much. And I also would like to remind you that it's very good to hear that Portugal will follow over the presidency for the EU Council and will follow the German efforts and the German path in this sense as well. So we are taking the whole efforts with us. So thank you very much. It was really inspiring, and I wish you a nice day. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen from Berlin.